The judge's chambers smelled of old leather and tobacco smoke. Clara sat rigid in a wooden chair, her spine refusing to touch the backrest. Judge Whitmore drummed his thick fingers on the mahogany desk, studying her with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. "You understand the situation, Miss Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara's jaw tightened. "I understand that I'm being railroaded." Whitmore's expression didn't change. He'd heard worse from better women. "Mary Howell died under your care. Her husband wants justice. The community wants answers. What you call railroading, the law calls accountability. Mary Howell died because she'd been beaten half to death before I ever arrived," Clara shot back. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled in her lap. "I told the constable. I documented the bruises. Nobody cared then, and nobody cares now." "That's speculation," Whitmore said dismissively. "Daniel Howell is a respected member of this community, a deacon at the church. You, on the other hand, are an unmarried woman with questionable methods and a reputation for overstepping your station." The injustice of it burned in Clara's throat like acid. She'd spent 3 years apprenticing with Dr. Holloway in St. Louis, learning anatomy and pharmacology when most midwives relied on superstition and prayer. She'd read medical journals smuggled from Boston and Edinburgh. She'd saved 17 women in cold water alone. 17 difficult births that should have ended in tragedy. But none of that mattered now. "Here are your options," Whitmore continued, pulling a document from his desk drawer. "Option 1. You stand trial for negligent homicide. Given the current sentiment in town, I'd say a guilty verdict is all but guaranteed. You'd be looking at hard labor, possibly worse." Clara's stomach turned. She'd heard stories about women's prisons, the typhoid, the brutality, the way inmates simply vanished from the record books. "Option 2, Whitmore said, sliding the document across the desk. You accept an alternative arrangement, marriage to a suitable party willing to take responsibility for your conduct." Clara stared at the paper. The handwriting was cramped and legal, full of archaic phrasing about obligations and duties. "You're selling me." "I'm offering you a chance at redemption," Whitmore corrected. "The gentleman in question is Elias Crow. He has a homestead 20 miles north, good land, adequate resources. He's agreed to the arrangement." The name meant nothing to Clara. She'd been in Coldwater for 8 months and knew most families by sight, but Elias Crow was unfamiliar. Why would a stranger agree to marry a woman accused of murder? Whitmore's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Mister, Crow has his own complications. Let's just say this arrangement benefits both parties. You gain protection from prosecution. He gains assistance." The vagueness set off warning bells in Clara's mind. "What kind of complications?" "Nothing that should concern you," Whitmore said. "You'll have a roof over your head, food, and the legal protection of marriage. In exchange, you'll manage his household and avoid practicing midwifery in cold water. Consider it exile with benefits." Clara's laugh was bitter. "So my choices are prison or indentured servitude to a man I've never met." "Your choices," Whitmore said coldly, "are consequences of your actions. Sign the document or face trial. Decide now." Through the window, Clara could see Main Street. A group of women stood outside the general store, their heads bent together in conversation. When one of them glanced toward the courthouse, the others turned away deliberately. Clara recognized them. Women whose babies she'd delivered, whose bleeding she'd stopped, whose lives she'd saved. Not one of them had spoken in her defense. The truth settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had already been convicted. The trial would be theater, the verdict predetermined. Daniel Howell had money and influence. Adelaide Pierce had tears and a compelling story. Clara had only the truth, and in Coldwater, Montana, in the winter of 1887, truth was worth less than nothing. She picked up the pen. "Where do I sign?" The wagon ride to Elias Crow's homestead took 4 hours through country that grew progressively more desolate. Judge Whitmore had arranged for a driver, a taciturn man named Jessup, who answered Clara's questions with grunts and shrugs. "What's he like?" Clara asked as the wagon jolted over frozen ruts. "Elias Crow," Jessup spat tobacco juice over the side. "Keeps to himself." "Is he cruel? Violent?" "Ain't never heard of him hurting nobody." It was faint praise, but Clara clung to it. The February landscape rolled past. Endless snow, skeletal trees, mountains rising like broken teeth against a colorless sky. This was frontier country, raw and unforgiving. Homesteads appeared sporadically, smoke rising from chimneys, then nothing for miles. "Why doesn't he come to town?" Clara pressed. Jessup was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "Folks don't take kindly to him. Say he's cursed." Clara's blood chilled. "Cursed how?" "Talk as he's deaf and dumb. Been that way since he was a boy. Some accident or sickness? Nobody knows. His family tried everything. Doctors, priests, even a spiritualist from Denver. Nothing worked. Parents died, left him the land. He's been alone up there near 15 years. The pieces began to fall into place. Whitmore's evasiveness, the arranged marriage. A deaf mute would struggle to find a wife through conventional means, especially on the frontier where survival demanded constant communication and cooperation. "So he needs someone to manage his household," Clara said slowly. "Someone who can hear and speak." "I reckon," Jessup agreed. "And I need legal protection from a murder charge I don't deserve." Jessup glanced at her, something almost like sympathy in his weathered face. "Ma'am, I delivered 6 kids with my wife. Lost 2 of them. I know the difference between bad luck and bad doctoring. What happened to Mary Howell weren't your fault." The unexpected kindness nearly broke Clara's composure. She blinked hard against sudden tears. "Then why didn't you say something at the hearing?" "'Cause I got a family to feed and a farm that don't run itself," Jessup said quietly. "Daniel Howell owns half the grain contracts in the county. You cross him, you starve. That's just how it is." Clara understood. She didn't forgive, but she understood. Fear was a more powerful force than justice. The sun was low when they finally turned onto a narrow track marked by a weathered post. The homestead appeared gradually, first a barn, solid and well-maintained, then a cabin built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from the chimney. Chickens pecked in a sheltered coop. A woodpile, neatly stacked, stood against the barn. "He keeps it decent," Jessup observed, pulling the wagon to a stop. The cabin door opened. Clara's first impression of Elias Crow was size. He stood well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, dressed in work-worn wool and leather. His hair was dark, touched with gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been past 40. His face was hard-planed, weathered by wind and sun, marked by old scars, one along his jaw, another cutting through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention. They were watchful, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just stood in the doorway, assessing her with the same careful scrutiny she'd seen in trappers evaluating pelts. Jessup climbed down and gestured to Clara. "This here's Clara Vance, your wife, I suppose. Got the papers right here." Elias's gaze shifted to the documents Jessup pulled from his coat. He read them carefully, his expression unchanged, then nodded once. "She's got a trunk," Jessup said, pointing to Clara's belongings. "And the judge said to tell you the arrangement stands as written. Any problems, you send word." Elias nodded again. He moved to the wagon and lifted Clara's trunk with unsettling ease, carrying it into the cabin without waiting for instruction. Clara climbed down on shaking legs. The reality of her situation was sinking in fast. She was 20 miles from the nearest town, married to a stranger who couldn't speak, with no means of escape and no legal recourse. Jessup touched his hat brim. "Good luck, ma'am." Then he was gone, the wagon rattling back down the track, leaving Clara alone with her silent husband. The cabin's interior was Spartan but clean. One main room served as kitchen and living space, with a fireplace that radiated welcome heat. A door in the back presumably led to a bedroom. Shelves held basic supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee. Pelts hung on the walls alongside tools and a rifle. Everything was organized with military precision. Elias set her trunk down and pointed to the bedroom, then to her, then to himself, then to a pallet by the fireplace. The meaning was clear. She would take the bed, he would sleep by the fire. "Thank you," Clara said, though she wasn't sure he could read her lips. He didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, he moved to the fireplace and began preparing dinner with practiced efficiency. Venison from a cold cellar, potatoes, wild onions. His movements were economical, purposeful. No wasted motion. Clara stood awkwardly, uncertain of her role. She was a guest, a wife, an exile, a prisoner, all at once and none completely. Finally, she moved to help, reaching for a knife to cut the vegetables. Elias's hand shot out, catching her wrist. Clara froze. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute, immovable. His eyes locked on hers, and she saw something there. Not anger, but wariness. The caution of an animal that had learned the hard way not to trust. Slowly, deliberately, he released her. He pointed to a chair at the rough-hewn table, then to himself, then to the food. The message? Sit. Let me cook. Clara sat. She watched him work, this silent stranger who was now legally her husband. He moved with confidence in his own space, navigating by sight and touch, compensating for his deafness with hyper-awareness of his environment. When the wind shifted, he noticed. When a log settled in the fireplace, he glanced toward it. He existed in a world of vibrations and visual cues, completely cut off from sound. What would that be like? Clara tried to imagine it. The absolute silence, the isolation. No birdsong, no thunder, no human voices, no music, no laughter. How did someone survive that without going mad? Dinner was simple but good. Elias ate methodically, his attention divided between his plate and Clara. She could feel him studying her, trying to understand what he'd agreed to when he'd signed those papers. Clara cleared her throat, though she knew he couldn't hear. I suppose we should establish some ground rules. He didn't react. She tried again, waiting until he looked at her, then speaking slowly and clearly. Ground rules. For living together. Nothing. Either he couldn't read lips or he chose not to engage. Frustration bubbled up in Clara's chest. She'd been accused of murder, forced into marriage, and exiled to the wilderness. The least this man could do was acknowledge her existence. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Elias's head snapped up, his body tensing. Clara grabbed a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and found a clear section of wall. In large, clear letters, she wrote, "Can you read?" Elias approached slowly. He studied the words for a long moment, then picked up the charcoal himself. Below her question, he wrote in surprisingly neat script, "Yes." Relief flooded through Clara. Communication. They had a method of communication. She wrote, "I need to understand the arrangement." Elias hesitated, then wrote, "Marriage. You stay. You work. I provide." Clara's jaw tightened. She wrote, "I am not a servant." Elias's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something less severe. He wrote, "Neither am I." It was the closest thing to conversation they'd had. Clara felt a small victory. She wrote, "Why did you agree to this?" Elias stared at the question for a long time. When he finally answered, his handwriting was more careful, deliberate. Alone too long. Need help. You need protection. Fair trade. It was brutally honest. No romance, no pretense. Just a transaction between two desperate people. Clara wrote, "I will not share your bed." Elias nodded immediately and wrote, "Understood. Not while you are here." The relief was overwhelming. Whatever else Elias Crow might be, he wasn't planning to force himself on her. She wrote one final message for the night. "Thank you for the food. Good night." Elias nodded and pointed to the bedroom. Clara took her trunk and retreated, closing the door behind her. The bedroom was small but adequate. A bed with a thick quilt, a washstand, a window overlooking dark forest. Clara sat on the bed and allowed herself finally to cry. Great, shaking sobs that she muffled in her hands. She cried for the injustice, for the loss of her life's work, for the fear that had become her constant companion. But beneath the tears, something else stirred. Determination, survival instinct. She was alive and she was free from prison. This wasn't the life she'd wanted, but it was better than the alternative. She would adapt. She would survive. And someday, somehow, she would find a way to clear her name. The first week passed in tense silence. Clara learned the rhythms of the homestead: early rising, chores divided by capability, simple meals, early bed. Elias worked constantly, chopping wood, tending the animals, checking traps, repairing tools. Clara took over cooking, cleaning, and mending, tasks she'd done for herself, but never as a full-time occupation. They communicated through written notes and gestures. It was tedious, but functional. "Need more flour," Clara would write. Elias would nod and add it to a list he kept for his monthly trip to a trading post. "Chimney needs cleaning," Elias would write. Clara would nod and help him move the furniture. It was a strange kind of partnership, practical, emotionally distant, but not unkind. Elias never raised his hand to her, never demanded anything unreasonable. He gave her space and expected the same in return. But Clara found herself growing curious about him. She watched the way he moved through the world, confident on his own land, but she'd noticed how he tensed whenever she suggested accompanying him to check the trap lines, how he positioned himself with his back to walls, how he startled if she approached from behind, even though he couldn't hear her footsteps. These were the behaviors of someone who'd been hurt, someone who'd learned to expect danger. One afternoon, while Elias was in the barn, Clara explored the cabin more thoroughly. She found very little of a personal nature. No letters, no photographs, no mementos. But in a trunk beneath the bed, she discovered books, medical texts, agricultural manuals, anatomy drawings. They were well worn, margins filled with notes in Elias's careful handwriting. He was educated, self-taught perhaps, but educated. Clara was studying a particularly detailed anatomical diagram when Elias returned. She looked up guiltily, expecting anger at the invasion of privacy. Instead, he simply stood in the doorway, watching her. Clara held up the book. "These are good," she said. Then remembered he couldn't hear her. She grabbed the charcoal. "You studied medicine?" Elias approached and took the book from her hands. He opened it to a section on the human ear, pointing to a diagram of the inner ear's anatomy. Then he wrote, "Trying to understand why I cannot hear." Clara's heart clenched. She wrote, "Have you seen a doctor?" Elias's expression hardened. He wrote, "Many. When I was young, they said nothing could be done." Clara studied the diagram he'd indicated. The inner ear was complex, tiny bones, fluid-filled chambers, delicate membranes. Damage to any component could cause deafness. But she'd read about cases in medical journals, unusual presentations, treatable conditions misdiagnosed as permanent damage. She wrote, "May I examine you?" Elias stepped back, shaking his head sharply. Clara wrote quickly, "I was a midwife, but I studied general medicine. I might see something the other doctors missed." Elias stared at her, and Clara saw something she hadn't expected. Hope, quickly smothered by old disappointment. He'd been let down before. Promised cures that never materialized. Why should she be different? But finally, reluctantly, he nodded. Clara gestured for him to sit. Her heart was pounding. She had no instruments, no proper lighting, just her knowledge and her hands. But she'd learned to work with less. She started with the external ear, examining the structure for deformities. Nothing obvious. Then she gently palpated the area around his ear and jaw, feeling for swelling or abnormalities. Elias remained perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his knees. "I need to look inside," Clara said, knowing he couldn't hear her but hoping he'd understand from her gestures. She mimed looking, pointing to his ear. He nodded. Clara tilted his head to catch the afternoon light. The ear canal appeared normal at first glance. She peered deeper, wishing for an otoscope or even a simple mirror and candle arrangement. Then she saw it. Something small and pale, partially blocking the canal. Not wax. The texture was wrong. It looked almost like... Clara's breath caught. She pulled back, her mind racing. Elias immediately tensed. He grabbed her wrist and wrote with his free hand, "What?" Clara's hand trembled as she wrote, "I need better light and tools. There is something in your ear. Not normal." Elias's eyes widened. He wrote, "What kind of something?" Clara hesitated. What she'd glimpsed was impossible, or at least extremely rare, but she'd read about such cases in medical literature. Parasites that entered through the ear canal, typically in childhood, burrowing into the tissue. They could survive for years, growing slowly, causing progressive hearing loss, headaches, neurological symptoms. She wrote carefully, "I need to investigate more before I say. Do you have frequent headaches?" Elias nodded emphatically. He pointed to his left temple. Do you sometimes feel pressure or movement inside your head? Another nod, more hesitant, as if he'd been afraid to admit it even to himself. Clara's pulse hammered. She wrote, I need to build some tools. It will take a few days. Then I will know more. Elias grabbed her hand, his grip desperate. He wrote, Can you fix it? Clara met his eyes. She saw everything there. Years of isolation, of being dismissed as broken and useless, of hope raised and crushed. She wanted to promise him a miracle, but she'd learned the hard way that promises could destroy you. She wrote, I will try. It was the most honest thing she could offer, and for the first time since their marriage, Elias Crow smiled. Over the next 3 days, Clara threw herself into preparation with fierce intensity. She fashioned tools from what she had. A thin probe from a straightened fishhook, a mirror from polished metal, an improvised light source using a candle and curved tin. She reviewed everything she remembered about ear anatomy and parasitic infections, drawing diagrams, making notes. Elias watched her work with growing anticipation. He brought her materials without being asked, wire, metal scraps, better light. He didn't write questions, but she could feel them hovering between them. On the third evening, Clara wrote, I am ready to try tomorrow. It may hurt. Elias wrote back immediately. I have lived with this for 18 years. Pain is familiar. That night, Clara barely slept. She went over the procedure in her mind, accounting for every risk. If she was right, if what she'd glimpsed was truly a parasite, extraction could be dangerous. The creature might have attached to sensitive tissue. Removing it could cause bleeding, infection, or further damage. But leaving it would certainly cause progressive deterioration. At dawn, she set up her makeshift operating area near the window where the morning light was strongest. She boiled water, sterilized her improvised tools, and laid everything out with methodical precision. Elias appeared, already awake. His eyes were red-rimmed, as if he'd slept as poorly as Clara. She wrote, Sit here. Stay very still, fool. This will be difficult. Elias sat. He tilted his head without being asked, offering the affected ear. Clara's hands were steady as she positioned the mirror and light. The magnification was crude but sufficient. She could see the pale shape more clearly now, definitely organic, definitely alive. It pulsed slightly with Elias's heartbeat. She picked up the probe and wrote one more message. If you need me to stop, raise your left hand. Understood? Elias nodded. His jaw was set, his hands gripping the chair arms. Clara took a deep breath and began. The probe slid into the ear canal with agonizing slowness. She had to work blind for the first part, navigating by feel, terrified of puncturing the eardrum or damaging the tiny bones of the middle ear. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Elias's breathing was harsh but controlled. He didn't move, didn't flinch. The probe touched something soft. Clara adjusted the angle of the mirror, trying to see. There. The parasite's body, pale and segmented, partially embedded in the canal wall. It was a botfly larva. Clara had seen illustrations in medical texts, but never a live specimen. They typically infested livestock, occasionally humans in tropical regions. How one had ended up in Montana, in a child's ear, was a mystery. But nature was full of improbable horrors. The extraction would require extreme care. If the larva broke apart, pieces could remain, causing infection. If she damaged it in the wrong way, it might burrow deeper. Clara used the probe to very gently work around the larva's attachment point. The creature moved, sensing the disturbance. Elias's hand shot up reflexively, not the signal to stop, just an involuntary response to sensation he'd never experienced before. Clara paused, letting him adjust. Then she continued, working with infinite patience, separating the larva from the surrounding tissue millimeter by millimeter. Minutes stretched into an hour. Clara's back ached from the awkward position. Her eyes burned from the strain. But she didn't stop. Finally, she felt the attachment give way. The larva was free, clinging only to the probe. Clara withdrew it slowly, praying it wouldn't slip free and fall back into the canal. Light, air. The larva emerged, pale, segmented, grotesquely alive, nearly an inch long. Clara dropped it into a jar of alcohol, where it writhed briefly before dying. Elias was trembling. Blood trickled from his ear, not much, but enough to concern her. Clara cleaned the wound with boiled water, applied a poultice of herbs she'd gathered, and bandaged it carefully. When she finally stepped back, she wrote, "It is out, a parasite, living in your ear for years." Elias stared at the jar, at the creature that had stolen 18 years of his life. His face was unreadable. Shock, rage, relief, all tangled together. Then his hands began to shake. Not from fear, from something else. He stood abruptly and walked to the door, threw it open, stood in the threshold, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. And then Clara saw it. His expression transforming, eyes widening, mouth opening in shock. He could hear, not perfectly. Probably still impaired, the damage partially permanent. But after 18 years of absolute silence, any sound must have been overwhelming. Elias turned back to Clara, tears streamed down his face. He opened his mouth, and a sound emerged, rusty, unpracticed, but unmistakably human. "You." The word was barely recognizable, his voice like gravel. "You fixed." He couldn't finish. He sank to his knees, hands covering his face, his whole body shaking with sobs. Clara knelt beside him. She touched his shoulder, a tentative connection. And for the first time since their forced marriage, Elias Crow reached out and held her, clinging to her like a drowning man to driftwood, crying like the lost child he'd been when the world had abandoned him to silence. Clara held him and let him weep, because she understood. She knew what it was to be cast out, to be broken by a world that had no room for anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions. Two outcasts, forced together by circumstance. But in that moment, something shifted. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were beginning to fight back. The days that followed the extraction were unlike anything Clara had experienced in her 26 years. Elias's recovery was not the steady, predictable progression she'd read about in medical texts. It was chaotic, overwhelming, and at times terrifying for both of them. The first morning after the procedure, Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass. She bolted from the bedroom to find Elias standing in the middle of the main room, hands pressed against his ears, surrounded by shattered pottery. His eyes were wild, disoriented. "Too loud!" he gasped, the words mangled but comprehensible. "Everything too loud!" Clara approached slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. She spoke softly, though she wasn't sure what volume was appropriate for someone whose brain had spent 18 years in silence. "It's the water, from the pump outside. The wind in the trees. Normal sounds." Elias shook his head violently. "Not normal. Screaming. All of it screaming." Of course. His auditory system had never learned to filter, to prioritize, to separate important sounds from background noise. Every stimulus hit with equal, overwhelming force. The drip of melting snow from the roof, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of fabric. All of it was an assault. Clara moved to the window and closed the shutters, muffling the outside world. The reduction in stimulation was immediate. Elias's breathing slowed, his hands lowering cautiously. "Better?" Clara asked. He nodded, then winced at the sound of his own movement. "Yes, better." Over the following weeks, Clara helped him navigate this new reality. They kept the cabin quiet, speaking in whispers, moving deliberately. She taught him exercises she'd read about in neurological journals, focusing on single sounds, identifying sources, building tolerance gradually. But the most remarkable change wasn't the hearing itself. It was the voice. Elias had been 9 years old when the parasite had stolen his hearing. He'd had language then, words and syntax and the foundation of communication. But 18 years of silence had atrophied those muscles, buried those neural pathways. Now, every sentence was a battle. The chickens, he would say, frustration evident in his clenched jaw. Need water? Food? The chickens need food? Clara would supply gently. The chickens need food. Food, Elias would repeat, committing the connection to memory. Need food. It was painstaking work, but Elias approached it with fierce determination. He'd spent nearly 2 decades cut off from human connection. Now, finally, he had a chance to reclaim it. He wasn't going to waste it. Clara found herself drawn into the project with unexpected intensity. Teaching Elias to speak again gave her purpose beyond mere survival. She'd been a healer once, had felt the satisfaction of bringing life into the world, of solving problems others couldn't. This was different but equally profound, watching a grown man rebuild himself word by word. They fell into new rhythms. Mornings were for chores, completed in relative silence to avoid overwhelming Elias's still sensitive hearing. Afternoons were for speech practice, with Clara correcting pronunciation and grammar while Elias filled notebooks with vocabulary. Evenings were for reading aloud, Clara's voice steady and clear, while Elias followed along, his lips forming the words silently. It was during one of these evening sessions, nearly a month after the extraction, that Elias finally asked the question Clara had been dreading. Why did they send you here? His voice was stronger now, though still rough. What did you do? Clara's hand stilled on the book. She'd known this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it easier. They blamed me for a woman's death, she said quietly. Mary Howell. She died 2 days after giving birth. Hemorrhage, infection, both complicated by injuries she'd sustained before I ever arrived. Elias's eyes narrowed. Injuries? Her husband beat her, Clara said bluntly. Regularly, severely. I documented bruises, broken ribs, signs of repeated trauma. I reported it to the constable. He told me to mind my own business. So when she died, her husband needed someone to blame. The town needed a scapegoat. I was convenient. Clara's voice hardened. Daniel Howell is a deacon, a businessman, a pillar of the community. I was an unmarried woman with unconventional methods. The choice was obvious. Elias was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then, you tried to help her. I tried to save her, Clara corrected, but some damage can't be undone. By the time she went into labor, her body was already failing. I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. They should have blamed him. The husband. Clara's laugh was bitter. Should have, but powerful men don't face consequences in places like Coldwater. They make the consequences for everyone else. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the old scar. I know about powerful men. Clara waited, sensing a story beneath those words. Elias set down his own book, his fingers tracing the worn cover. I was 9. There was a doctor from back east. He came to examine me. Said he could fix the deafness. What did he do? Put things in my ears, instruments, probes. Said he was clearing blockages. Elias's voice dropped. He hurt me, made it worse. When my parents complained, he said I was difficult, uncooperative. He left town, never faced consequences. Clara's stomach turned. Did he see the parasite? I don't know. Maybe he didn't look. Maybe he didn't care. Elias met her eyes. After that, my parents stopped trying, said it was fate, that I should accept it. So you were 9 years old, in pain, and everyone just gave up on you? Yes. Clara felt rage rising in her chest, the same rage she'd felt watching Mary Howell die, watching the town close ranks around her killer. The system protected certain people and devoured others. It had devoured Elias as a child. It had tried to devour her. But they were still here, still fighting. We should have been enemies, Clara said softly. You should have resented being forced to take in a woman accused of murder. I should have resented being sold like livestock. But we're not. Enemies. Elias's voice was stronger now, more certain. We're survivors. Yes, Clara agreed. We are. Something shifted between them in that moment. The marriage had begun as a transaction, a mutual protection arrangement. But it was becoming something else, a partnership built on shared understanding, on recognition of each other's wounds. They were two people the world had tried to break, and they were still whole. The spring thaw came gradually, revealing a landscape Clara had only seen under snow. Green appeared in patches, wildflowers pushed through muddy earth, and the forest came alive with sounds that still sometimes overwhelmed Elias, but were growing more manageable. With warmer weather came visitors, the first Clara had seen since Jessup had delivered her to the homestead. She was hanging laundry when she spotted the wagon approaching, dust rising from the road. Elias was in the barn, and she called to him instinctively before remembering he might not hear her at that distance. But he emerged anyway, alerted by some other sense, his rifle held loosely in one hand. The wagon held two men. Clara recognized the driver, Mr. Brennan, who ran the trading post. The other man was older, gray-haired, wearing a suit that marked him as someone of importance. "Mr. Crow," Brennan called out, his tone cautious. "Got someone here needs to speak with you." Elias approached slowly, his posture defensive. Clara moved to stand beside him, presenting a united front. The suited man climbed down from the wagon with difficulty, his movements stiff. "Mr. Crow, my name is Thomas Whitlock. I'm an attorney from Helena. I've been trying to reach you for several months." Elias's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. "About what?" Whitlock's eyes widened slightly. "You can speak?" "Recently," Elias said shortly. "What do you want?" Clara noticed Brennan's shocked expression, the way his mouth hung open. News of Elias's recovery would spread quickly. Whitlock recovered his composure. "Your uncle, Samuel Crow, passed away last winter. You're his only living relative. He left you his estate, approximately 40 acres of timberland along the Clearwater River, plus mineral rights, and a considerable sum in the Helena Bank." Elias stared at him. "I don't know a Samuel Crow." "Your father's brother. There was a falling out years ago before you were born. But Samuel never married, never had children. His will specifically names you as heir." Clara watched understanding dawn on Elias's face. "How much money?" Whitlock pulled papers from his satchel. $32,000. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. That was a fortune. Enough to buy land, equipment, livestock. Enough to start over anywhere in the country. "There are conditions," Whitlock continued. "The will stipulates that you must claim the inheritance in person and provide proof of identity. Given your previous limitations, your uncle wasn't certain you'd be able to do so. If you don't claim it within 1 year of his death, the estate goes to the state." "When did he die?" Clara asked. "December 14th. You have until mid-December to make your claim." Elias looked at Clara, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. "That means going to Helena." "Yes. The bank and courthouse require personal appearance. I have the documents here if you'd like to review them." They invited Whitlock inside, though Elias kept the rifle within reach. Clara made coffee while the attorney spread papers across the table, explaining inheritance laws and transfer procedures. It was all legitimate. She'd seen enough legal documents during her apprenticeship to recognize authentic paperwork. "This is real," she murmured to Elias while Whitlock was distracted with his satchel. "Can we trust him?" Clara studied the attorney, his expensive suit, his careful manner, his obvious discomfort in the rustic cabin. "I think so. This kind of inheritance would be public record. He'd gain nothing by lying." When Whitlock finally left, promising to return in the fall to escort them to Helena, Clara and Elias sat in stunned silence. $32,000, Elias said finally. "It changes everything. We could leave. Go anywhere." His eyes met hers. "You could go back to medicine, real medicine, not hiding in the wilderness." Clara's heart leaped at the possibility. With money like that, she could go to a real medical school, study formally, earn credentials that would make her accusations harder to dismiss. But even as hope surged, reality crashed down. "I'm still wanted in Coldwater," she said. "Judge Whitmore's arrangement means I stay away, but it doesn't clear my name. If I try to practice medicine elsewhere, word would spread. Daniel Howell's accusations would follow me." Elias's jaw set. "Then we clear your name first." "How? We have no evidence, no witnesses willing to speak, no way to force a reopening of the case." "We have money," Elias said. "Or we will. Money changes things, opens doors. Not for women accused of murder. Maybe not, but it's worth trying." Elias reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The gesture was still new enough to surprise her. "You gave me my voice back. Let me help you get yours back." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She'd spent so long fighting alone, expecting nothing from anyone. The offer of genuine help was almost overwhelming. "We'd need evidence," she said. "Proof of what Daniel Howell did to Mary, medical records, testimony, something concrete." "Do such records exist?" Clara thought back to those terrible days. "I kept notes. Detailed documentation of Mary's injuries, my treatment, her decline. I left them with Dr. Holloway in St. Louis. He was my mentor. He promised to keep them safe. Then we get them. We find witnesses, we build a case. It's dangerous. If Daniel Howell finds out we're investigating, let him find out, Elias said, his voice hard. I spent 18 years as a victim. I'm done with that. Clara looked at her husband, this man who'd been a stranger 4 months ago, who'd become a patient, then a student, now an ally. He was right. They'd both been victims long enough. All right, she said. We fight back. The plan took shape over the following weeks. They would travel to Helena in the fall to claim the inheritance. Along the way, they'd stop in St. Louis to retrieve Clara's documentation. They'd hire an attorney, a real one, not some small-town judge with divided loyalties. They'd force Coldwater to reopen Mary Howell's case. But first, Elias needed to continue his recovery. His hearing was improving but still fragile. His speech was functional but required constant practice, and there were psychological adjustments neither of them had anticipated. One night, Clara woke to the sound of Elias's voice. Not words, but a low, keening sound like an injured animal. She rushed from the bedroom to find him sitting by the dying fire, his head in his hands. What's wrong? She asked, kneeling beside him. I can hear myself, he whispered. My voice, I sound wrong. Clara understood. He'd never heard his own voice before, had no frame of reference for what he should sound like. The rough, unpracticed sound must be jarring, alien. You sound fine, she said gently. I sound broken. You sound like someone who's learning. That's different from broken. Elias looked at her, his eyes haunted. What if I can't be normal? What if I'm always going to be the deaf-mute, even with hearing? Normal is a trap, Clara said fiercely. I tried to be normal, a quiet, obedient woman who didn't ask questions or challenge authority. It nearly destroyed me. You're not broken, Elias. You're different. And different is exactly what this world needs. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, how did you survive it? The accusation, the trial, being sent here? Clara considered the question. Rage, mostly. I was so angry at the injustice that I couldn't give up. Anger kept me alive when nothing else would. And now? Now I want more than survival. I want justice. For Mary, for myself, for every woman whose truth gets buried by powerful men's lies. She met his eyes. What about you? What kept you going all those years? Stubbornness, Elias said, almost smiling. My parents wanted me to accept the deafness, to live small and grateful. I refused, learned to read, to write, to manage the farm, proved I could survive alone. His smile faded. But surviving alone isn't living. No, Clara agreed. It isn't. They sat together in the firelight, two damaged people discovering they might be stronger together than they'd ever been apart. As summer progressed, they began preparing for the journey to Helena. Elias taught Clara to shoot, to track, to navigate by stars and landmarks. Clara taught him to read social cues, to modulate his voice for different situations, to function in a hearing world. They were becoming a team, but the past wasn't finished with them yet. In early August, another visitor arrived. This time, a woman Clara recognized immediately. Adelaide Pierce, the sister who'd wept on the witness stand, who'd called for Clara's imprisonment. Elias was away checking the northern trap line. Clara was alone when Adelaide's horse approached, moving slowly, uncertainly. The woman looked different from Clara's memory, thinner, older, her face lined with something that might have been guilt or grief. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the rifle by the door, but she didn't pick it up. Not yet. Adelaide dismounted with visible effort. Mrs. Crow? She called out. May I speak with you? You testified against me, Clara said coldly. You blamed me for your sister's death. I know. I was wrong. Adelaide's voice broke. That's why I'm here. Clara stepped onto the porch, keeping distance between them. If this is some trick, it's not. Please, just let me explain. Against her better judgment, Clara nodded. Adelaide approached slowly, like one might approach a wild animal. Up close, Clara could see the bruises, faint but present, yellowing marks on Adelaide's wrists, a healing split in her lip. Daniel did that to you, Clara said flatly. Adelaide's hand moved to her lip reflexively. He's my brother-in-law. After Mary died, he asked me to move in, help with the house. I thought he needed family, but he needed a replacement. Yes. Adelaide's eyes filled with tears. You were right about everything. Mary told me months before she died, told me about the beatings, the cruelty. I didn't want to believe her. Daniel was respected, important. I thought she was exaggerating. So you let her suffer? Yes. And then she died, and Daniel said you were to blame, and I believed him because it was easier than admitting I'd failed her. Adelaide's voice dropped to a whisper. But now I'm living it. Now I understand what she went through, and I can't stay silent anymore. Clara felt a complex tangle of emotions, anger, vindication, pity. Why tell me? Why now? Because you deserve the truth. Because Mary deserved better than what we gave her. Adelaide reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a bundle of papers. These are letters. From Mary to me. She wrote them over the course of 2 years, describing everything Daniel did. I burned most of them after she died. But I kept these last few. I don't know why. Maybe I knew deep down that I'd need them someday. Clara took the letters with trembling hands. Mary's handwriting was shaky but legible, the content damning. Detailed accounts of violence, threats, isolation, names, dates, specific incidents. This is evidence, Clara breathed. I'll testify, Adelaide said. In court, in front of everyone. I'll tell them what Daniel did, what I knew and ignored. I'll make this right. He'll destroy you. He's already destroying me. At least this way, Mary's death will mean something. Clara looked at this broken woman who'd contributed to her exile, who was now offering redemption. It would be easy to refuse, to turn her away. But Clara had learned that justice required uncomfortable alliances. When Elias and I go to Helena in the fall, we're going to hire an attorney. We're going to reopen Mary's case. If you're serious about testifying, I am, Adelaide said immediately. Whatever it takes. Clara nodded slowly. Then we have a chance. When Elias returned that evening, Clara showed him the letters. He read them in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. This changes everything, he said finally. Adelaide wants to testify. With her statement and these letters, we might actually have a case. Elias set the letters down carefully. Daniel Howell won't let this happen without a fight. I know. He'll come after us. After Adelaide. He has money, connections, power. And we have the truth, Clara said. That has to count for something. Elias looked at her, and she saw determination in his eyes, the same determination that had kept him alive through 18 years of silence. Then we make it count. They spent the rest of August planning. Adelaide visited twice more, each time bringing more evidence, medical bills from doctor, haze that documented Mary's injuries, testimony from neighbors who'd heard screaming, records of Daniel's business dealings that showed a pattern of intimidation and control. The picture that emerged was damning. Daniel Howell wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a predator who'd used his position and reputation to brutalize with impunity. Why did no one stop him? Clara asked during one of Adelaide's visits. Fear, Adelaide said simply. Daniel controls grain contracts, shipping routes, credit at the general store. Cross him and you lose your livelihood. In a town like Coldwater, that's a death sentence. So everyone knew and did nothing. Everyone except you. You tried to help Mary. You documented the truth. And they punished you for it. Clara felt the old rage stirring, but beneath it was something new, determination, purpose, the sense that she was finally on the right path. In September, as the aspens turned gold and the nights grew cold, Elias and Clara made final preparations for their journey. They would leave after the first frost, travel south through the mountains to St. Louis, then west to Helena. It would take weeks, possibly months. The night before their departure, they sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Are you afraid? Elias asked. His voice was almost normal now, the roughness smoothed by months of practice. Terrified, Clara admitted, but also excited. For the first time since Mary died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. What if we fail? What if the courts side with Daniel anyway? Then we tried. That's more than most people can say. Elias reached for her hand, and Clara laced her fingers through his. The gesture was natural now, comfortable. Somewhere along the way, their marriage of convenience had become something real. I never thanked you, Elias said quietly, for the extraction, for giving me my voice back. You don't need to thank me. We saved each other. Yes, Elias agreed. We did. They sat in companionable silence, two outcasts who'd found each other in the wilderness, who'd discovered that survival was only the beginning. Now they were heading back into the world that had cast them out. But they weren't the same people who'd been exiled. Clara wasn't the frightened midwife forced into an arranged marriage. Elias wasn't the silent, broken man the town had forgotten. They were survivors, partners, warriors preparing for battle. And they had no intention of losing. The journey to St. Louis took 3 weeks through mountain passes already dusted with early snow. Clara and Elias traveled light, their wagon loaded with supplies and the carefully protected bundle of Mary's letters. They spoke little during the long days, both lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. When they finally reached the city, the noise and chaos nearly overwhelmed Elias. He'd spent most of his life in silence, then months in the relative quiet of the wilderness. St. Louis assaulted his senses, street vendors shouting, wagons clattering over cobblestones, steam whistles from riverboats, 1,000 conversations bleeding into an incomprehensible roar. Clara watched him pale, his hands clenching the reins too tight. We can find somewhere quiet, she said. Rest before we see Doctor. Holloway? No. Elias's voice was strained but determined. We're here. We finished what we started. Dr. Holloway's office was in a modest building near the medical college where Clara had apprenticed. The older man answered the door himself, his eyes widening in shock when he recognized her. Clara Vance, my dear girl, I thought... He stopped, glancing at Elias. Please, come in. The office smelled of carbolic acid and old books, achingly familiar. Clara introduced Elias, watching Holloway's surprise when her husband spoke clearly, articulately, explaining their purpose. You kept my notes? Clara asked. From the Howell case? Holloway moved to a locked cabinet, withdrawing a leather portfolio. Of course. I knew something was wrong with that trial. Your documentation was too thorough, too professional. I suspected someday it might be needed. He spread the papers across his desk. Clara's meticulous records of Mary Howell's injuries, her observations about causation, her attempts to report the abuse. It was all there, preserved in Clara's careful handwriting. This is excellent work, Holloway said, reading. Any competent physician would see immediately that the injuries preceded the birth, that the complications arose from prior trauma, not from negligent care. Will you testify to that? Elias asked. Holloway hesitated. Testify where? Coldwater is outside my jurisdiction. My word would carry limited weight in a Montana territorial court. We're not going back to Coldwater, Clara said. Not yet. We're going to Helena first to hire a proper attorney and file a formal complaint. We want to force a real investigation. With what evidence? Clara explained about Adelaide's letters, her willingness to testify, the accumulating documentation of Daniel Howell's pattern of violence. Holloway listened, his expression growing graver. You understand what you're attempting? Daniel Howell isn't just some frontier brute. Men like that have networks, allies, ways of protecting themselves. Even with evidence, conviction would be difficult. We're not looking for easy, Elias said. We're looking for justice. Holloway studied them both, this unlikely pair, so obviously united in purpose. Finally, he nodded. Then you'll have my testimony. And more. I know physicians in Montana Territory, good men who understand the political pressures in small communities. I'll write letters of introduction. It won't guarantee success, but it might open doors. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The road ahead is going to be brutal. They spent 2 days in St. Louis, during which Holloway connected them with colleagues and helped Clara compile a comprehensive medical analysis of Mary's death. He also introduced them to a law professor at Washington University who provided guidance on territorial legal procedures. You'll need to file in Helena, the professor explained. The Territorial Attorney General has authority to investigate cases where local officials may be compromised. But you'll need compelling evidence of corruption or misconduct, not just a single case of suspected abuse. We have evidence of Judge Whitmore's involvement, Clara said. He arranged my forced marriage to avoid a trial. That suggests he knew the case against me was weak. That's a start. But you'll need more. Witnesses willing to testify about the judge's relationship with Howell, evidence of other cases where justice was perverted, a pattern of corruption. It seemed insurmountable, but they'd come this far. The journey to Helena took another 2 weeks, crossing the vast Montana plains as winter settled in earnest. They reached the territorial capital in late October, the city sprawling along the Last Chance Gulch, still rough from its gold rush origins but developing the infrastructure of governance. Thomas Whitlock, the inheritance attorney, met them at the bank where Samuel Crow's estate was held. The transfer was remarkably straightforward. Elias signed documents, provided identification, answered questions about his uncle's history. By afternoon, they held bank drafts totaling $32,000. "You're a wealthy man now," Whitlock observed. "What will you do with it?" "Buy justice," Elias said simply. Whitlock's eyebrows rose. "An expensive commodity. We're willing to pay." The attorney studied them thoughtfully. "I practice estate law, but I know someone who might help you. Matthias Cole. He's a prosecutor, handles criminal cases for the territorial government. He has a reputation for taking on powerful interests." "Will he see us?" Claire asked. "For a case like this?" "I think he might." Matthias Cole's office was in the territorial courthouse, a substantial stone building that spoke of permanence and authority. Cole himself was younger than Clara expected, mid-30s, tall and lean, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to their story without interruption, occasionally making notes. When they finished, he sat back, fingers steepled. "Let me be clear about what you're asking. You want the territorial government to investigate a respected businessman in a small community, reopen a case that was legally settled through a marriage arrangement, and potentially prosecute both the businessman and a sitting judge for corruption and murder." "Yes," Clara said. "Based on letters from an abuse victim, testimony from her sister who initially testified against you, and medical records from a physician in St. Louis, and my own documentation," Clara added, "and evidence of Judge Whitmore's misconduct." Cole tapped his pen against the desk. "It's not impossible, but it's close. Territorial resources are limited. We can't pursue every complaint, especially ones that involve overturning local decisions." "So you won't help us," Elias said flatly. "I didn't say that." Cole leaned forward. "I'm interested. Cases like this, where local power structures protect abusers, they poison entire communities. But I need more than interest. I need ammunition." "What kind of ammunition?" Clara asked. "Other victims. Other cases where Howell or Whitmore bent the law. Pattern evidence that shows this wasn't an isolated incident, but systemic corruption." Cole pulled out a map of Montana territory. "Coldwater is here, about 100 miles southeast. Small town, maybe 400 people. In communities that size, everyone knows everyone's business. If Howell has been abusing women for years, people know. If Whitmore has been covering for him, there's a trail." "No one will talk," Clara said. "They're too afraid. They might talk to a territorial investigator with subpoena power, especially if they believe there's real potential for justice." Cole looked between them. "But I'll be honest. This investigation could take months. And even if we build a case, there's no guarantee of conviction. Howell will hire the best defense attorneys money can buy. He'll attack your credibility, Mrs. Crow. Your forced marriage, your exile, your unconventional medical methods, all of it will be used against you." "Let him try," Clara said. "I've got nothing left to lose." "What about you?" Cole asked Elias. "You're risking your inheritance, your reputation, possibly your freedom. If this goes badly, Howell could file countersuits, tie you up in court for years." Elias's expression was hard. "I spent 18 years in silence because a doctor couldn't be bothered to look closely enough. Clara saved me when no one else cared to try. If she says Daniel Howell murdered his wife and the system protected him, I believe her. And I'll spend every dollar of this inheritance proving it if I have to." Cole smiled slightly. "All right then. Let's go to war." The investigation began immediately. Cole assigned 2 territorial marshals to travel to Coldwater and begin interviewing residents. Meanwhile, Clara and Elias rented rooms in a Helena boarding house and prepared for the fight ahead. The marshals returned after 3 weeks with news both encouraging and disturbing. They'd found 5 other women willing to testify about Howell's violence, Former employees, women he'd courted before Mary, even a distant cousin. They'd also discovered financial irregularities in Whitmore's court records, cases dismissed or settled under suspicious circumstances. It's enough to convene a grand jury, Cole told them in his office. We'll present the evidence, call witnesses, and see if we can get an indictment. When? Clara asked. January. Gives us time to prepare, and it'll be harder for Howell to intimidate witnesses once they're under territorial protection. But Daniel Howell had no intention of waiting for January. The first sign of trouble came in mid-November when Adelaide Pierce failed to arrive for a scheduled meeting. Cole sent a marshal to check on her, and he returned with grim news. She's gone. House is empty. Looks like she left in a hurry. Neighbors say Daniel showed up 3 days ago with some men. There was shouting, then Adelaide rode out with them. No one's seen her since. Clara's blood ran cold. He took her. Or she went willingly, the marshal said. Could be he convinced her to recant. Adelaide wouldn't do that. She came to me, she brought the letters, she wanted to make things right. Cole's expression was troubled. We need to find her. Without Adelaide's testimony, our case is weaker. The letters are powerful, but defense will argue they could be fabricated. They spent the next week searching. Marshals checked every town within 100 miles, interviewed stage drivers and railroad clerks, followed every lead. No sign of Adelaide Pierce. Then, in early December, a letter arrived at Cole's office. The handwriting was Adelaide's, but the words felt wrong. I have reconsidered my previous statements regarding my sister's death. After much reflection and prayer, I realized I was mistaken in blaming Daniel Howell. Clara Vance's medical treatment was negligent, and I should not have allowed my grief to cloud my judgment. I withdraw any cooperation with the territorial investigation and ask that my letters be disregarded as the product of temporary emotional distress. Clara read it twice, her hand shaking. This isn't real. Someone forced her to write this. Probably, Cole agreed, but we can't prove it. And without Adelaide, the letters become questionable evidence. We still have the other witnesses, Elias said, the women who testified about Howell's violence. 3 of them have also recanted, Cole said grimly. I got telegrams this morning, all 3 claiming they misremembered, that they were confused, that Daniel Howell never hurt anyone. Clara felt the walls closing in. He got to them, threatened them, paid them, something. Almost certainly. But again, we can't prove coercion without witnesses willing to testify about being coerced. And if they're too scared to maintain their original statements, they're definitely too scared to accuse Howell of intimidation. So that's it? Clara's voice rose. He wins because he's powerful enough to terrorize anyone who might speak against him? Not necessarily. Cole pulled out another file. We still have your medical documentation, Holloway's analysis, and the financial irregularities in Whitmore's court. That's enough to raise questions, maybe enough to force an inquiry, but it's not the slam-dunk case we had with Adelaide and the other witnesses. Elias stood abruptly. Then we need to make him show his hand. Force him into the open where he can't hide behind intermediaries and threats. How? Cole asked. Clara goes back to Coldwater. The room went silent. Clara stared at her husband. That's insane. The moment I set foot in that town, Whitmore will have me arrested. Exactly, Elias said. We force a confrontation. You go back, you publicly challenge the case against you, you demand a trial. Not the arranged marriage deal, a real trial with a real jury. They'll convict her, Cole said. Local jury, local judge, all of Howell's influence, she'll be found guilty before the trial starts. Maybe, but not quietly. We make it public. We get newspaper coverage, bring in observers from Helena, force everything into the light. Howell and Whitmore have been operating in shadows. They threaten witnesses in private, manipulate records behind closed doors. But a public trial? That's different. That's scrutiny they can't control. Clara's heart was pounding. The idea terrified her, but she saw the logic. If I force a trial, and they convict me based on obviously false evidence, it strengthens our corruption case. It also puts you in prison, Cole pointed out, possibly for years while we work through appeals. Not if we're smart about timing, Elias said. We schedule the trial for mid-January, same time the grand jury is supposed to convene in Helena. We have marshals present, newspapermen, witnesses. If Howell and Whitmore do anything illegal, threaten jurors, tamper with evidence, suborn perjury. We catch them in the act. Cole was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, it's incredibly risky, but it might work. If nothing else, it would demonstrate the extent of local corruption. And if we can document witness intimidation or judicial misconduct in real time, that's grounds for federal intervention. Clara looked at Elias. You're talking about using me as bait. I'm talking about finishing what we started. You wanted justice for Mary. This is how we get it. It could get me killed. I won't let that happen. Clara saw the determination in his eyes, the same fierce protectiveness he'd shown when learning about her exile. This man who'd been silent for 18 years, who'd learned to speak again just months ago, was willing to walk into danger for her. She turned to Cole. If we do this, I want guarantees, territorial marshals present throughout the trial, an independent court reporter, and a direct line to your office if things go wrong. You'll have all of that, Cole promised, and more. I'll come myself, present the territorial government's interest in the case. It'll make clear this isn't just a local matter anymore. Then let's do it, Clara said. Let's drag Daniel Howell and Judge Whitmore into the light and watch them burn. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Cole filed motions demanding Clara's right to a full trial rather than the arranged plea deal. Newspaper editors in Helena were briefed on the case, their interest piqued by the elements of corruption and abuse. Marshals were assigned to provide security and observe the proceedings. Elias used a portion of the inheritance to hire additional attorneys, not to represent Clara directly, since Cole was handling that, but to observe and document everything that happened. He also hired a stenographer to create an independent record of the trial. Through it all, Clara prepared herself mentally for what was coming. She would have to return to Coldwater, face the people who'd condemned her, sit in a courtroom, and relive Mary Howell's death. She would have to endure Daniel Howell's presence, his lies, his attempts to destroy her credibility. But she wouldn't be alone this time. She had Elias, who'd proven himself a partner in every sense. She had Cole, who believed in the case enough to risk his professional reputation. She had the truth, documented and preserved. It would have to be enough. They arrived in Coldwater on a bitter January morning, the town gray and frozen under heavy clouds. Clara felt eyes on her the moment their wagon rolled down Main Street. Conversations stopped. Women turned away. Men watched with hard expressions. Judge Whitmore was waiting at the courthouse, his face florid with anger. This is highly irregular, Mrs. Crow. The arrangement we made was clear. You agreed to exile in exchange for avoiding trial. I was coerced, Clara said clearly, her voice carrying in the cold air. I was threatened with imprisonment and given no real choice. Now I'm demanding the right to defend myself properly. You have no grounds. The Territorial Attorney General disagrees, Cole interrupted, stepping forward. I'm Matthias Cole, and I'm here representing the territorial government's interest in this case. Mrs. Crow has the right to a trial. You'll convene one within the week, or I'll file a motion to have you removed from the bench for judicial misconduct. Whitmore's face went from red to purple. You have no authority here. I have all the authority I need. Cole produced a document. Signed by the territorial governor himself. You'll conduct a fair trial, Judge, or you'll face investigation for corruption. Your choice. The small crowd that had gathered murmured. Clara saw Daniel Howell standing near the general store, his expression unreadable. He was a handsome man, she had to admit, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. But she saw past the facade now, saw the cruelty in his eyes, the calculation. He met her gaze and smiled slightly, as if to say this changed nothing. Clara smiled back, a cold expression that promised war. The trial was set for 1 week later, giving both sides time to prepare. Clara and Elias stayed at the only hotel in town, their room guarded by territorial marshals around the clock. The tension was palpable. Residents who'd once greeted Clara warmly now crossed the street to avoid her. Shop owners refused to serve them. Children threw rocks at their window. They hate us, Clara observed one evening, watching another group of men gather outside. Their voices angry, but not quite loud enough to justify intervention. They hate change, Elias corrected. We represent truth they don't want to face, that their deacon is a murderer, that their judge is corrupt, that they all stood by and let it happen. Will the jury see it that way? I don't know, but we're going to make them look. The night before the trial, Adelaide Pierce appeared. Clara was in her hotel room reviewing notes when a soft knock came at the door. The marshal stationed outside checked, then admitted a woman wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face hidden. When she lowered the hood, Clara gasped. Adelaide was barely recognizable, thin to the point of emaciation, bruises covering her face and neck, one eye swollen shut. "I'm sorry," Adelaide whispered. "I'm so sorry. He made me write that letter. He said if I didn't recant, he'd kill me. I believed him." Clara helped her to a chair. "Where have you been?" "His house. Locked in a room upstairs. He kept me there, said I was sick, that I needed rest. But really, he was making sure I couldn't talk to anyone." "How did you escape?" "I didn't. He let me out tonight, said the trial tomorrow would prove you were guilty and then I could go home. But I can't. I can't let this happen again. Mary died because I was too afraid to help her. I won't make that mistake twice." Elias had entered during this exchange. "You're willing to testify, even knowing what it might cost?" "I'm already dead if I don't," Adelaide said simply. "Daniel made that clear. At least this way Mary's death means something." Cole arrived within the hour, bringing a physician to document Adelaide's injuries and a stenographer to record her statement. By midnight, they had everything they needed: Adelaide's testimony, her explanation of the coerced recantation, medical evidence of ongoing abuse. "This changes everything," Cole said. "With Adelaide's testimony, we don't just have a case against Howell for Mary's murder. We have witness intimidation, false imprisonment, assault. He's going down." But Clara couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Daniel Howell wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have released Adelaide unless he was confident it wouldn't matter. What was he planning? The courthouse was packed when they arrived the next morning. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, more crowding outside. Clara saw newspapermen from Helena and even Denver, their notebooks ready. She saw the territorial marshals positioned strategically, hands near their weapons. She saw Daniel Howell sitting calmly at the prosecutor's table, looking for all the world like a grieving widower seeking justice. And she saw the jury, 12 men, all of them known to her by sight, if not by name. Farmers, shopkeepers, men who owed Daniel Howell money or favors or their livelihoods. Men who would vote the way they were told. Judge Whitmore called the court to order, his gavel crack echoing in the sudden silence. The Territory versus Clara Vance, charged with negligent homicide in the death of Mary Howell. How does the defendant plead? Clara stood, Elias beside her, Cole at her other side. She looked at the judge, at Daniel Howell, at the jury that had already convicted her in their hearts. And she spoke clearly, her voice unwavering. "Not guilty, Your Honor, and I'm prepared to prove it." The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by a lawyer Daniel Howell had imported from Denver, a man named Harrison Wells who wore expensive suits and spoke with practiced sympathy. He painted a picture of tragedy, a devoted husband who'd lost his beloved wife to the incompetence of an arrogant midwife who'd overstepped her training. "Mary Howell was a gentle soul," Wells said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "A loving wife who deserved better than what she received in her final hours. The defendant, Clara Vance, fancied herself a physician despite lacking proper credentials. She experimented with dangerous techniques, ignored warning signs, and ultimately caused the hemorrhage that took Mary's life." Clara watched the jury's faces. Most wouldn't meet her eyes. They'd already decided. Wells continued, building his narrative with carefully selected facts. Mary's death from hemorrhage, true. Clara's presence at the birth, true. The lack of formal medical credentials, technically true, though misleading. He wove it all together into a story of negligence and hubris. When he finished, Cole rose for the defense opening. He was quieter than Wells, less theatrical, but his words carried weight. "The prosecution wants you to believe this is a simple case of medical negligence. It isn't. This is a case about power, about what happens when truth threatens powerful men, about a community that chose comfort over justice." He paused, letting the words settle. Mary Howell died because she was beaten repeatedly by her husband over the course of 2 years. The medical evidence will show this conclusively. The only question is whether you have the courage to see it. A ripple went through the courtroom. Daniel Howell's face remained impassive, but Clara saw his hands tighten on the table. Whitmore banged his gavel. "The jury will disregard that inflammatory statement. Mr. Cole, Confine yourself to facts, not speculation. It's not speculation, Your Honor. It's what the evidence will prove. The first witness was Dr. Hayes, Coldwater's only physician. He was an older man, nervous, clearly uncomfortable. Wells led him through testimony about Mary's final days, the difficult labor, the hemorrhage, the unsuccessful attempts to save her. In your professional opinion, Dr. Hayes, could this death have been prevented with proper medical care? Hayes hesitated. It's difficult to say. Childbirth carries inherent risks. Yes or no, doctor? Could proper care have saved Mary Howell? Possibly, if the hemorrhage had been controlled earlier. Thank you. No further questions. Cole approached for cross-examination, carrying a folder. Dr. Hayes, you examined Mary Howell's body after death, correct? Yes. And you noted bruising and healed fractures in your report? Hayes shifted uncomfortably. I noted some contusions, yes. Some contusions. Let me read from your report. Cole opened the folder. Extensive bruising to the rib cage, both fresh and in various stages of healing. 3 ribs previously fractured, healed improperly. Contusions to the upper arms consistent with gripping, scarring around the wrists. Does that refresh your memory? Yes. Those injuries were present. Did you report them to the authorities? Silence. Hayes looked at Judge Whitmore, then at Daniel Howell. I didn't feel it was relevant. A woman covered in injuries of various ages, and you didn't feel it was relevant to investigate how she received them? Objection, Wells said. Argumentative. Sustained, Whitmore said quickly. Cole shifted tactics. Dr. Hayes, in your medical opinion, could these injuries, the broken ribs, the extensive bruising, could they have contributed to complications during childbirth? Hayes swallowed hard. It's possible. Damaged ribs could affect breathing, make labor more difficult. Could they cause the kind of hemorrhage that killed Mary Howell? Objection. Calls for speculation. Your Honor, this is a medical expert. He's qualified to provide professional opinions. Whitmore looked trapped. Answer the question, Doctor. Hayes's voice was barely audible. Yes. Severe abdominal trauma could potentially cause internal bleeding that might not present until stress was placed on the body, like labor. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Clara saw several jury members glance at Daniel Howell with new suspicion. No further questions, Cole said. The next several witnesses were character witnesses for Daniel Howell, fellow church deacons, business associates, neighbors who testified to his reputation as an upstanding citizen. Wells was building a wall of respectability around his client, but Cole dismantled it brick by brick during cross-examination. A deacon admitted under questioning that he'd heard arguments from the Howell house, that once he'd seen Mary with a black eye she claimed came from falling. A business associate acknowledged that Daniel had a temper, that he'd seen him become violent when deals went wrong. A neighbor testified that she'd heard screaming from the Howell residence multiple times, but had never investigated because it wasn't her business. By the lunch recess, the picture of Daniel Howell as a pillar of the community was showing cracks. But Wells wasn't finished. That afternoon, he called his star witness. The prosecution calls Daniel Howell. The courtroom went silent as Daniel took the stand. He moved with quiet dignity, his expression appropriately somber. When he placed his hand on the Bible to swear his oath, Clara noticed several jury members nodding approvingly. Wells led him through prepared testimony. Daniel spoke of his love for Mary, their plans for the future, his devastation when she died. He described Clara's arrival at their home, her dismissive attitude toward his concerns, her insistence on using techniques he didn't understand. She barely looked at Mary, Daniel said, his voice breaking convincingly. She was more interested in proving how clever she was than in actually helping my wife. Did you see evidence of negligence that night? I saw her refuse to call Dr. Hayes until it was too late. I saw her use instruments I'd never seen before, force Mary into positions that caused her pain, and I saw her stand by while my wife bled to death. It was a masterful performance. Clara saw sympathy on the jury's faces, saw them looking at her with renewed hostility. Wells finished with a question calculated for maximum impact. Mr. Howell, did you ever harm your wife? Never. Daniel's voice rang with conviction. I loved Mary more than life itself. The suggestion that I would hurt her is obscene. No further questions. Cole stood slowly. He approached the witness stand with careful deliberation, carrying Adelaide's letters. Mr. Howell, you testified that you loved your wife. Do you recognize this handwriting? Daniel barely glanced at the letters. That's Mary's handwriting. These are letters she wrote to her sister Adelaide over the course of 2 years. Would you like me to read them to the court? Objection, Wells said sharply. Hearsay. The author is deceased and cannot verify authenticity. They're authenticated by Adelaide Pierce, who received them and will testify to their authenticity. Whitmore looked between the lawyers, clearly calculating. Finally, I'll allow limited excerpts for the purpose of impeachment. Cole began reading. Mary's words filled the courtroom, descriptions of violence, of fear, of desperate attempts to hide injuries and maintain appearances. She wrote of Daniel's rages, his accusations, his promises that it would never happen again, followed inevitably by more violence. Daniel's calm facade began to crack. Those are lies. Mary was confused, emotional. Confused? She documents specific dates, specific injuries, specific threats you made. Are you saying she fabricated all of this? I'm saying she exaggerated. All couples argue. Is breaking your wife's ribs an argument, Mr. Howell? I never broke her ribs. Dr. Hayes' report shows 3 fractured ribs, healed improperly. How do you explain that? She fell. She was clumsy. 3 separate times, all causing rib fractures? Daniel's voice rose. I don't have to explain accidents to you. What about the bruises around her wrists? The kind doctor, Hayes testified, were consistent with gripping, with restraint? I don't know where those came from. Cole's voice remained level, relentless. You don't know where any of the injuries came from? Not the ribs, not the bruises, not the scarring? She was sick. She bruised easily. Mr. Howell, did you or did you not confine your sister-in-law Adelaide Pierce to your home against her will for the past 6 weeks? The courtroom exploded. Wells was on his feet shouting objections. Whitmore was banging his gavel, but Cole's voice cut through the chaos. We have Adelaide Pierce here, Your Honor. She's prepared to testify about her imprisonment, about being forced to recant her statement, about the ongoing pattern of violence and intimidation. Daniel lunged from the witness stand. You lying witch! You and that cripple husband think you can destroy me? 2 marshals grabbed him before he could reach Clara. The courtroom was in uproar, people shouting, reporters scribbling frantically. Whitmore's gavel cracked like gunfire. Order! I will have order! But the damage was done. The mask had slipped. The jury had seen Daniel Howell's rage, had heard him attack Clara and Elias with venom that belied his claims of innocence. Cole waited for the chaos to subside, then said quietly, No further questions, Your Honor. The afternoon session began with Adelaide Pierce's testimony. She looked small and broken in the witness chair, but her voice was steady as she described her imprisonment, the threats, the forced recantation. Wells tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she was mentally unstable, that her injuries were self-inflicted, that she was being manipulated by Clara. But Adelaide had lived through worse. She met Wells's attacks without flinching. I watched my sister die slowly over 2 years, she said. I ignored her pleas for help because I was afraid of what people would think. I'm not making that mistake again. Daniel Howell beat Mary to death. It just took a long time, and this town let him do it because he's rich and powerful, and it was easier to blame a woman than hold a man accountable. The gallery was silent. Even Wells seemed at a loss for words. That evening, Clara and Elias sat in their hotel room while marshals stood guard outside. The trial would resume tomorrow with expert testimony from Dr. Holloway, then closing arguments. We're winning, Elias said. The jury saw Daniel lose control. They heard Adelaide's testimony. They can't ignore it. But Clara wasn't so sure. They can ignore anything if they're scared enough, and Daniel Howell is a dangerous man to cross. Her fears proved justified the next morning. They arrived at the courthouse to find it surrounded by a crowd far larger than the previous day. Men with hard faces blocked the entrance. Clara recognized several of them, workers from Howell's grain operation, men who depended on him for their livelihoods. Cole approached the leader. We're here for the trial. Let us through. Trial's over, the man said. Town's decided we don't need outside agitators stirring up trouble. The trial continues until the jury renders a verdict. That's the law. We make our own law here. The territorial marshals moved forward, hands on their weapons. The crowd tensed. Violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Judge Whitmore appeared on the courthouse steps. "That's enough. Everyone stand down." The crowd turned to him. Whitmore looked older suddenly, his bluster gone, replaced by something that might have been fear, or might have been conscience, finally making itself heard. "This trial will continue," Whitmore said. "Whatever verdict is reached, it will be reached legally, in that courtroom, not in the street. Anyone who interferes will be arrested for contempt and held until the territorial government decides what to do with them. Is that clear?" The crowd muttered, but slowly parted. Clara, Elias, and Cole made their way inside, the marshals forming a protective corridor. Once in the courtroom, Whitmore called both attorneys to the bench. "This ends today," he said quietly. "I want closing arguments, jury deliberation, and a verdict. No more delays." "Your Honor, we still have expert testimony," Cole began. "I'll allow your expert's written statement into evidence, but no more witnesses. This town is a powder keg. We finish this before someone gets killed." Cole glanced at Clara. She nodded slightly. They'd made their case. Now it was up to 12 men to decide what truth meant. Dr. Holloway's written analysis was entered into evidence, a comprehensive medical opinion concluding that Mary Howell's death resulted from complications arising from prior traumatic injuries, not from negligent care during childbirth. It was damning, professional, irrefutable to anyone with medical knowledge. But the jury weren't physicians. They were farmers and shopkeepers being asked to destroy a man who controlled their economic futures. Wells delivered his closing argument with the same polished sympathy he'd shown throughout. He acknowledged that Mary had injuries, but suggested they came from accidents, from her own clumsiness. He painted Clara as an outsider who'd poisoned the town against one of its own, who'd manipulated evidence and coached witnesses to serve her own vindictive purposes. "This trial isn't about truth," Wells said. "It's about power." Clara Vance couldn't accept that she'd made a mistake, that her arrogance had cost a life. So she's constructed this elaborate fiction, this conspiracy theory, to avoid accountability. Don't let her divide this community. Find her guilty and restore order. Then it was Cole's turn. He didn't orate. He didn't perform. He simply laid out the evidence piece by piece, the medical reports, the letters, Adelaide's testimony, Daniel's own violent outburst in court. The prosecution wants you to believe this is complicated. It isn't. A man beat his wife for 2 years. When she died from complications of those beatings, he blamed the midwife who tried to save her. The town went along with it because it was easier than confronting an ugly truth. But you have a chance now to do what's right, to say that violence won't be tolerated, that power doesn't put anyone above justice, that truth matters. He paused, looking at each juror. Mary Howell can't speak for herself. Adelaide Pierce risked everything to speak for her. Dr. Hayes confirmed what happened, even though it frightened him. Clara Vance is here demanding accountability, even though it could cost her freedom. All these voices are telling you the same thing. The only question is whether you're brave enough to listen. The jury retired to deliberate at 2 p.m. Clara, Elias, and Cole waited in a small room while the crowd outside grew larger and more agitated. Marshals reported that Daniel Howell was in his office across the street, visible through the window, watching. "What if they convict?" Clara asked quietly. "Then we appeal," Cole said. "With this record, we'd have grounds. The territorial Supreme Court would likely overturn. But I'd still go to prison while we waited." Cole didn't deny it. "Yes." Elias took her hand. "I won't let that happen." "You might not have a choice." "I'll always have a choice." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. As the sun set and lamps were lit in the courtroom, word came that they'd reached a verdict. The room filled quickly, the same crowd as before, but tenser, angrier. Clara saw Daniel Howell enter, his face carved from stone. She saw Adelaide sitting in the back, protected by a marshal. She saw newspapermen poised to capture whatever happened next. The jury filed in. None of them looked at Clara. Whitmore addressed the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find?" The foreman stood. His hands shook slightly as he read from the paper. "In the matter of the territory versus Clara Vance, on the charge of negligent homicide, we, the jury, find the defendant—" Clara's heart stopped. She felt Elias's grip tighten on her hand. "Not guilty." The courtroom exploded. Half the room erupted in outrage, the other half in relief. Daniel Howell was shouting something Clara couldn't hear over the chaos. Wells was on his feet demanding a mistrial. The newspaper men were racing for the door to file their stories. But all Clara could focus on was those two words. Not guilty. She was free. Whitmore was banging his gavel, calling for order, but it was futile. The marshals moved to surround Clara and Elias as the crowd surged forward. Then someone shouted, "Fire!" The word cut through everything else. People turned toward the windows where orange light was flickering. Smoke was beginning to seep under the courthouse door. "The hotel!" someone yelled. "The hotel's burning!" The hotel where Clara and Elias had been staying, where their belongings were, their documents, the evidence they'd gathered. Clara locked eyes with Daniel Howell across the chaos. He was smiling. The crowd fled the courthouse, some to fight the fire, others just to escape. Marshals tried to maintain order, but it was impossible. In the confusion, Clara felt herself being pulled away from Elias, swept up in the surge of bodies. She fought to stay close to him, calling his name, but the crowd was too thick. She caught glimpses, Cole shouting orders, Adelaide being escorted out by marshals, Elias's face desperate as he searched for her. Then strong hands grabbed her from behind, pulling her into a side corridor. She struggled, trying to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth. "Stop fighting," a voice hissed. "I'm trying to help you." Clara stilled, recognizing the speaker. It was Jessup, the wagon driver who'd brought her to Elias's homestead all those months ago. "Daniel's men are waiting outside," Jessup said quietly. "The fire's a distraction. They're planning to grab you in the confusion, make it look like you died in the chaos. We need to get you out of here." "Where's Elias?" "Your husband can take care of himself. Right now, you're the target." Jessup led her through back corridors Clara didn't know existed, down to a cellar that opened onto an alley behind the courthouse. A wagon waited there, driven by a woman Clara vaguely recognized, Jessup's wife. "Get in," Jessup ordered. "We'll take you to your homestead. You'll be safe there until things settle." "I can't leave Elias. He'll find you." That man tracked game through winter storms. "He'll know where you've gone." Clara hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. Then she heard shouts from above, heavy footsteps searching. She climbed into the wagon. They drove through the night, the sky behind them orange with flame. Clara learned later that the hotel burned to the ground, taking with it most of the business district. No one died, but the damage was catastrophic. And in the confusion, Daniel Howell disappeared. Jessup delivered Clara to the homestead as dawn broke, then left to return to town and find Elias. Clara waited, rifle in hand, watching the tree line for any sign of pursuit. Elias arrived at midday, riding hard, 2 marshals with him. When he saw Clara safe, the relief on his face was overwhelming. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I thought they'd taken you," he said. I'm here. I'm safe." They went inside, the marshals standing guard. Cole arrived an hour later with news. "The verdict stands. You're cleared of all charges. But Coldwater's in chaos. The fire destroyed half the town. Daniel Howell's gone, took a horse and rode out last night. We've got warrants out for his arrest on murder charges, witness intimidation, arson." "Judge Whitmore?" Clara asked. "Under arrest. We have enough evidence of corruption to prosecute. He's already talking, trying to make a deal. He's implicating Howell in multiple cases where justice was perverted." "So we won," Elias said. "You won," Cole corrected, "though it came at a cost. The investigation I mentioned, the grand jury, they've expanded their scope. They're looking at the entire territorial justice system, using this case as the catalyst. You've started something bigger than you know." Clara sank into a chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. They'd survived. They'd won. But the victory felt hollow, with Daniel Howell still free, still dangerous. "We'll find him," Cole promised. "Men like that always surface eventually, and when he does, we'll be ready." That night, alone with Elias in the cabin that had become their home, Clara finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they'd accomplished. They'd faced down a corrupt system, exposed a murderer, survived a mob's violence. They'd proven that truth, however inconvenient, could still triumph. "What happens now?" Elias asked. Clara thought about it. They had money, freedom, the satisfaction of justice served. They could go anywhere, do anything. But she kept thinking about Mary Howell, about Adelaide Pierce, about all the women who'd suffered in silence because the system protected their abusers, about communities where fear trumped justice, where power insulated men from consequences. "We get an education," Clara said finally. "Real medical training for me, legal training for you if you want it. We learn everything we can about how systems work, how to fight them, how to change them. And then? And then we come back. We build something better." Elias smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face. "A clinic?" "A clinic, a legal practice. Whatever we need to help people who can't help themselves. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing is." They sat together in the firelight, planning their future, two outcasts who'd found each other and discovered that survival was only the beginning. Justice was the next step. But revolution, real, lasting change, that was the destination. And they were just getting started. The spring of 1888 found Clara and Elias in Philadelphia, living in a modest boarding house near the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. The decision to pursue formal medical training had been Clara's, but Elias had insisted on coming with her, enrolling himself in classes at the University of Pennsylvania's law school. "I want to understand the system that nearly destroyed us," he'd said during the long journey east, "so I can help tear it down and build something better." The college had been reluctant to accept Clara at first. Her lack of formal credentials, her notoriety from the trial that had been covered in newspapers across the country, the mere fact that she was married, all of it worked against her. But Dr. Holloway had written a letter of recommendation so glowing that the dean couldn't ignore it, and Clara's entrance examination scores had been perfect. Still, she faced resistance from the beginning. Male students at the affiliated teaching hospital made their disdain clear. Professors questioned her presence in lectures. Patients sometimes refused her care when they learned she'd be attending them. But Clara had survived worse than academic snobbery. She kept her head down, worked harder than anyone else, and let her results speak for themselves. Elias faced his own battles. His speech had continued to improve, but he still occasionally struggled with pronunciation, still sometimes needed people to repeat themselves in crowded rooms where background noise overwhelmed his recovering hearing. Other students mocked his Western accent, his rough manners, the scars that marked him as someone who'd lived a harder life than they could imagine. He ignored them with the same stoic determination he'd shown during 18 years of silence. They studied together in the evenings, sharing what they'd learned, helping each other through difficult material. Clara taught Elias anatomy and medical terminology. Elias taught Clara contract law and constitutional principles. They were building themselves into weapons, educated, credentialed, legally formidable. But the past wasn't finished with them. In June, a telegram arrived from Matthias Cole. Clara read it twice before showing it to Elias. "Daniel Howell found, Canada. Extradition proceeding, trial set, August. Your testimony required." Elias looked up from his law books. "We have to go back." "I know." Clara's hands trembled slightly. She'd known this day would come, had prepared herself for it. But facing Daniel Howell again, reliving Mary's death and testimony, exposing herself to cross-examination, the prospect terrified her. "We don't have to," Elias said quietly. "Cole can prosecute without us. Adelaide's testimony, the medical evidence, the documented corruption, it's enough." "It's not about enough. It's about finishing what we started." Clara folded the telegram carefully. "Mary Howell deserves to have someone stand up in court and tell the truth about how she died. I owe her that." They traveled to Helena in late July, arriving to find the territorial capital transformed by their case. The corruption investigation had expanded beyond Coldwater, uncovering a network of judges, businessmen, and officials who'd been manipulating the justice system for profit. 6 judges had been removed from the bench. Dozens of cases were being reopened and reviewed. The trial of Daniel Howell had become a symbol, proof that even powerful men could face consequences. Cole met them at the train station, looking exhausted but grimly satisfied. "We've got him cold. The evidence is overwhelming. But Wells is still representing him, and he's going to make this ugly." "Let him try," Clara said. The trial began on August 10th in a packed courtroom that bore little resemblance to the chaotic scene in Coldwater. This was formal, procedural, with strict rules of evidence and a judge who brooked no nonsense. The jury had been selected carefully, screened for connections to Howell, or prejudice against women. Wells's strategy became clear during opening statements. Since he couldn't deny the evidence of abuse, the medical reports, the letters, Adelaide's testimony, he focused instead on Clara's credibility. Clara Vance is not the heroic figure the prosecution would have you believe, Wells said smoothly. She's a woman who resented authority, who performed experimental medical procedures without proper training, who was admitted to breaking laws when she felt justified in doing so. Yes, Daniel Howell was not a perfect husband, but imperfect marriages don't constitute murder. Mary Howell died from complications of childbirth, complicated by Mrs. Vance's arrogant belief that she knew better than trained physicians. It was a carefully constructed narrative designed to muddy the waters, to make the jury question whether they could trust anything Clara said. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days. Adelaide testified first, her account even more devastating than it had been in Coldwater. She described in detail the escalating violence, Mary's desperate attempts to hide the abuse, her own shameful complicity in ignoring her sister's suffering. Dr. Holloway testified next, walking the jury through the medical evidence with clinical precision. He showed them diagrams of Mary's injuries, explained how chronic trauma had weakened her body, demonstrated how the complications that killed her arose from pre-existing damage rather than negligent care. Other witnesses followed, the women from Coldwater who'd initially testified about Howell's violence, neighbors who'd heard screaming, business associates who'd seen his temper. One by one, they built an irrefutable picture of sustained, deliberate cruelty. On the 4th day, Clara took the stand. Cole led her through her qualifications, her training with Holloway, her 8 months practicing in Coldwater. He had her describe the night Mary Howell died in careful detail, the labor, the complications, the desperate attempts to control the bleeding. "When did you first observe the injuries that Dr. Holloway has described?" Cole asked. "When I arrived to attend the birth," Clara said. Mary's abdomen was covered in bruises, some fresh, some weeks old. Her breathing was labored because of the rib damage. When I examined her, I found evidence of repeated trauma consistent with severe physical abuse. What did you do with this information? I documented everything in my notes. After Mary died, I reported it to Constable Miller. He told me to mind my own business. Why didn't you pursue it further? Clara met the jury's eyes. Because I was a woman in a small town, making accusations against a powerful man. I knew what would happen, and I was right. I was blamed for Mary's death and exiled to avoid prosecution. Wells approached for cross-examination like a predator circling prey. Mrs. Crow, you've admitted to performing an invasive medical procedure on your husband without proper credentials or supervision. Is that correct? I extracted a parasite from his ear that had been causing deafness for 18 years. Multiple licensed physicians had examined him and failed to identify it. But you had no formal training in such procedures. I had anatomical knowledge and necessity. My husband was suffering. I helped him. You took a risk that could have killed him or caused permanent damage. That's not help, Mrs. Crow. That's hubris. Objection, Cole said. Argumentative. Sustained. Wells shifted tactics. You've stated that you believe powerful men should be held accountable for their actions. Do you believe that gives you the right to act as judge and jury yourself? Clara understood the trap. If she said yes, she'd appear lawless. If she said no, Wells would accuse her of hypocrisy. She chose a third option. I believe that when legal systems fail to protect the vulnerable, those of us with knowledge and ability have a moral obligation to do what we can. I don't claim the right to be judge and jury, but I do claim the right to document truth and demand accountability. Even when that truth is inconvenient? Even when it disrupts entire communities? Especially then. Convenient lies are what allow men like Daniel Howell to brutalize women with impunity. Wells's expression hardened. You seem to have a great deal of anger toward men, Mrs. Crow. Is it possible that this anger has colored your perception of Mr. Howell? That you saw abuse where there was only normal marital discord? Clara leaned forward slightly. I saw broken ribs. I saw bruises in the shape of handprints. I saw a woman who flinched when her husband entered the room and apologized reflexively for everything. That's not normal marital discord, Mr. Wells. That's terrorism. The courtroom stirred. Wells tried several more angles, but Clara met each attack calmly, refusing to be rattled. When she finally stepped down, she felt Elias's hand squeeze hers. He'd been sitting in the front row the entire time, his presence a steady anchor. The prosecution rested. Wells called only a handful of witnesses, character witnesses for Howell, who testified that he'd never seemed violent, that marriages were private matters, that Clara's accusations were politically motivated attempts to undermine traditional family structures. It was weak, and everyone knew it. Daniel Howell himself chose not to testify. Wells had clearly decided the risk was too great after Howell's outburst during the Coldwater trial. Closing arguments came on August 16th. Wells made his final appeal, arguing that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of biased witnesses. He painted Howell as a victim of changing times, of women who resented male authority, of a legal system that had been corrupted by radical elements. Cole's closing was simpler and more devastating. Daniel Howell beat his wife for 2 years. The medical evidence proves it. The letters prove it. The witnesses prove it. When she died from complications of that abuse, he blamed the midwife who tried to save her. That's not complicated. That's murder. And the only question before you is whether you have the courage to hold him accountable. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict without hesitation. Guilty of murder in the second degree. Guilty of witness intimidation, guilty of assault, guilty of unlawful imprisonment. Daniel Howell showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Clara saw his hands clench the table, saw the muscle jump in his jaw. He'd believed until the end that his money and connections would save him. They hadn't. Judge Harrison, a territorial appointee known for harsh sentencing, didn't hesitate. Daniel Howell, you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the heart of civilized society. You used your position and wealth to brutalize those who should have been able to trust you. You corrupted the legal system to escape justice. You represent everything this territory must evolve beyond if we are to call ourselves civilized. He paused, letting the words settle. I sentence you to 30 years in the territorial prison without possibility of parole. May you spend that time reflecting on the lives you've destroyed. The gallery erupted in cheers and protests in equal measure. Clara sat quietly, feeling not triumph, but a profound sense of completion. Mary Howell's death finally meant something. Her suffering had exposed a rot that was now being excised. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed them. Clara gave a brief statement, carefully worded with Elias's legal training in mind. Justice was served today, not just for Mary Howell, but for every woman who's been told to stay silent about abuse. But one verdict isn't enough. We need systematic change. Laws that protect victims, courts that take abuse seriously, consequences for those who use power to harm others. This is a beginning, not an end. That evening, Cole hosted a small dinner at his home. Adelaide was there, looking healthier than Clara had ever seen her. She'd moved to Helena, found work with a women's charitable organization, was rebuilding her life. What will you do now? Adelaide asked Clara. Finish medical school. Elias will finish law school. Then we're coming back. To Montana? To wherever we're needed. There are cold waters everywhere. Communities where power protects abusers, where truth is inconvenient, where people suffer in silence. We're going to change that. Cole raised his glass. To changing the world, one case at a time. They drank to that, a strange assemblage of people who'd been brought together by tragedy and transformed by the fight for justice. The next 3 years passed in a blur of intense study. Clara graduated from medical college in 1890, one of only 47 women to earn a medical degree that year. Elias finished law school the same year, passing the Montana bar examination on his first attempt. They returned to Montana in the spring of 1891, using what remained of Elias's inheritance to purchase land on the outskirts of Helena. The location was strategic, close enough to the territorial capital to access courts and government, far enough to maintain independence. They built 2 structures. The first was a medical clinic, modest but well-equipped, with separate examination rooms, a small surgical theater, and living quarters above. The second was a law office, connected to the clinic by a covered walkway. The sign over the clinic entrance read, Clara Vance Crow, M.D. The sign over the law office read, Elias Crow, Attorney at Law. Beneath both signs, in smaller letters, Justice and Healing, sliding scale fees, no one turned away. The first patient arrived before they'd finished unpacking. A woman, her face bruised, her arm broken, claiming she'd fallen. Clara recognized the lie immediately, had heard it too many times to count. She treated the arm, then sat down across from the woman. I need to document these injuries. You can tell me you fell, and I'll write that down. Or you can tell me the truth, and we'll figure out what to do next. The woman stared at her, calculating, afraid. My husband used to beat me, Clara said quietly. I understand the fear, but I also understand that silence is its own kind of death. You don't have to make any decisions today, but I want you to know that you have options. She handed the woman a card with the clinic and law office addresses. If you want help, medical, legal, or just somewhere safe to go, we're here. No judgment, no cost you can't afford, just help. The woman took the card with trembling hands. She left without saying anything more. 3 days later, she came back with her sister and a cousin and a neighbor. Word spread quickly. Women who'd been suffering in silence, who'd believed they had no recourse, began appearing at the clinic. Clara treated their injuries and listened to their stories. Elias filed protective orders, negotiated safe separations, and when necessary, prosecuted their abusers. It wasn't always successful. Some women went back to their abusers. Some cases were dismissed by sympathetic judges. Some men were too powerful to touch. But Clara and Elias fought anyway, case by case, patient by patient. They also took on other cases: medical malpractice suits against incompetent doctors, contract disputes where workers were being exploited, property cases where widows were being cheated by male relatives. They became known as advocates for people the system usually ignored. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways neither of them had anticipated. One evening in 1893, after a particularly difficult day, Clara found Elias in his office, surrounded by case files. "Tell me we're making a difference," she said, sinking into a chair. Elias looked up. His hearing had continued to improve, though he still struggled in noisy environments. His voice, once rough and uncertain, was now clear and authoritative, the voice of someone who'd learned to use words as weapons. "3 women in safe housing tonight who weren't yesterday," he said. 2 protective orders granted. 1 arrest warrant issued. Is it enough? No, but it's something. What happened to us? Clara asked. We used to be outcasts, just trying to survive. We stopped surviving and started living, Elias said. There's a difference. Clara thought about that. They'd been broken people once, she by a corrupt system, he by medical negligence and social abandonment. But they'd found each other in that brokenness and discovered that survival was only the beginning. The real work, the real purpose, came from using their pain to prevent others from suffering the same way. In 1895, Clara was invited to speak at the Women's Medical College's graduation ceremony. She stood before a room full of young women about to enter a profession that would challenge them at every turn. You will face resistance, she told them. Patients who don't trust you because of your gender. Colleagues who resent your presence. Systems designed to exclude you. You will be told you're not strong enough, not smart enough, not suited for this work. She paused, remembering her own struggles. Ignore them. You are here because you're brilliant and capable. You are here because patients need you, especially those patients who've been failed by arrogant men who couldn't be bothered to look closely enough, to listen carefully enough, to care deeply enough. She saw herself in their faces, young, determined, ready to fight for a better world. Some of you will go into prestigious practices and make groundbreaking discoveries. That's wonderful. But some of you will go to small towns and frontier communities where you'll be the only medical care for miles, where you'll deliver babies and set bones and treat diseases with limited resources, where you'll fight not just illness but ignorance and prejudice and power structures that protect abusers. Clara's voice grew stronger. That work is just as important, maybe more important, because that's where change really happens, in small communities, in individual lives, one patient at a time. Don't underestimate what you can accomplish. I was a disgraced midwife forced into exile. Now I'm a physician with a thriving practice, married to a man I helped heal, fighting for justice in a territory that tried to silence me. Your limitations are only what you accept them to be. The applause was thunderous. Afterwards, several students approached her with questions. One young woman hung back until the others had left, then asked quietly, "Is it true you performed surgery to remove a parasite from your husband's ear, without formal training?" Clara smiled. "It's true, though I don't recommend operating on family members if you can avoid it. The stress is considerable." "But you saved him." "We saved each other," Clara corrected. "That's usually how it works." By 1897, the clinic and law office had grown substantially. They'd taken on 2 associate attorneys and another physician, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd graduated from Johns Hopkins and wanted to practice frontier medicine. They'd also expanded their mission. In addition to direct patient care and legal representation, they'd begun advocating for legislative change. Elias drafted bills to strengthen protections for abuse victims, to give women more rights in divorce proceedings, to regulate medical practice and eliminate quacks. Not all of the bills passed. Montana Territory's legislature was still dominated by conservative interests resistant to change. But they won enough victories to matter. One afternoon in August 1897, Clara was treating a patient when she heard familiar voices in the waiting room. She finished the examination, then stepped out to find Matthias Cole and Adelaide Pierce waiting. "We should have sent word," Cole said, "but we wanted to surprise you." Clara embraced Adelaide, who'd become a friend over the years. "What brings you here?" Adelaide held up her left hand, displaying a wedding ring. "We're married, as of yesterday." Clara's delight was genuine. She'd watched these 2 people, both damaged by the same case that had nearly destroyed her, find solace in each other. "I'm so happy for you." "We wanted you and Elias to be among the first to know," Cole said. "You brought us together in a way. If not for Mary's case, we never would have met." "Good things can grow from tragedy," Clara said, "if we let them." They stayed for dinner, sharing stories and catching up. Cole had been appointed Territorial Attorney General, a position that gave him even more power to pursue corruption cases. Adelaide ran a women's shelter in Helena, providing safe housing for abuse victims. "We're all doing what we set out to do," Adelaide observed, "making the world a little better, one piece at a time." "It's not enough yet," Elias said, "but it's more than nothing." As Clara watched her friends, her husband, the life they'd built together, she felt profound gratitude. They'd all been broken by systems designed to crush anyone who didn't conform. They'd all survived by finding each other, by refusing to accept injustice, by fighting back. In 1899, a young woman appeared at the clinic. She was 17, pregnant, terrified. Her father had thrown her out. Her boyfriend had disappeared. She had nowhere to go. Clara treated her gently, examined her carefully, and assured her she'd be all right. Then she called Elias into the room. "This is my husband, Elias Crow. He's an attorney. If you want to keep your baby, we'll help you find housing and work. If you want to pursue legal action against the father, we'll help with that too. If you need medical care, I'm here. If you need legal protection, Elias is here. You have options." The girl started crying, not from fear this time, but from relief. "No one's ever helped me before." Clara took her hand. "That changes today." It was a small moment, one girl, one pregnancy, one offer of help. But Clara had learned that change happened through accumulation of small moments, small victories, small acts of kindness that compounded over time. They'd started as 2 outcasts forced together by circumstance. They'd become partners, then advocates, then a symbol of what was possible when broken people refused to stay broken. In the summer of 1900, Montana achieved statehood. Clara and Elias attended the celebration in Helena, watching as the territorial government transformed into something more permanent, more structured. "Do you think it'll be better now?" Clara asked. "As a state instead of a territory?" Elias considered the question. "Structure doesn't guarantee justice, but it creates more opportunities to demand it. More courts, more oversight, more accountability. More work for us. Always more work, but that's all right. We're good at work." They stood together watching the fireworks explode over the Capitol, 2 people who'd survived exile, abuse, corruption, and violence, who'd emerged not just intact but transformed. The town that had tried to erase them had burned and rebuilt. The man who'd killed his wife and tried to destroy Clara's life was in prison. The judge who'd enabled him had been disbarred and disgraced. The system that had protected them had been exposed and reformed. It wasn't perfect. Injustice still existed. Women still suffered abuse. Power still protected itself. But Clara and Elias had proven something important, that truth, properly documented and forcefully advocated, could triumph. That outcasts could become leaders. That survival could evolve into something more meaningful. "What do you think Mary would say?" Clara asked quietly. "If she could see what came from her death?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "I think she'd say it shouldn't have been necessary, that she shouldn't have had to die for change to happen. But it did happen. Yes, and we're going to make sure it keeps happening." They returned to their clinic the next day, to their patients and cases and fights. They worked through that year and the next, building a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of steady, determined advocacy for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. Years later, when Clara was old and Elias's hair had gone completely gray, a young reporter came to interview them for an article about frontier medicine. "People call you a pioneer," the reporter said. "How does that feel?" Clara laughed. "I was an outcast who got lucky. I had skills, I had a partner, I had resources. The real pioneers are the women who survive abuse with nothing, who fight for their children with no legal protection, who keep going when every door is closed against them. I just opened a few doors." "And you, Mr. Crow? What would you say your greatest achievement has been?" Elias looked at Clara, and even after decades together, she saw love and respect in his eyes. "Learning to hear," he said simply. "Not just sound, but truth. Learning that silence is violence, and that those of us who can speak have an obligation to speak for those who can't." The reporter scribbled notes. "That's very poetic." "It's very practical," Elias corrected. "We don't deal in poetry. We deal in law and medicine and practical help for people who need it." After the reporter left, Clara and Elias sat together in the office they'd shared for nearly 2 decades. The walls were covered with photographs, patients they'd helped, cases they'd won, lives they'd changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "The path we chose? We could have taken that inheritance and lived comfortably anywhere. We didn't have to come back and fight." "Not for a second," Elias said immediately. "We were given a chance most people don't get. To survive our trauma, to heal, to build something meaningful. Would you trade it?" Clara thought about the exhaustion, the frustration, the cases they'd lost, the patients they couldn't save. She thought about the comfort they'd sacrificed, the easier path they'd rejected. Then she thought about the 17-year-old girl who'd shown up pregnant and terrified, who now ran her own boarding house and helped other women in similar situations. About the woman with the broken arm who'd testified against her husband and was now safe. About the countless lives they'd touched, changed, saved. "No," she said, "I wouldn't trade any of it." They sat together as the sun set, 2 people who'd been cast out by the world and had responded by transforming it, not through grand gestures or revolutionary violence, but through patient, persistent, unglamorous work, through showing up every day and doing what needed to be done. 2 outcasts who'd become healers, 2 victims who'd become advocates, 2 broken people who'd proven that broken didn't mean worthless, that exile didn't mean defeated, that survival was only the beginning of what was possible. They'd rewritten their own fates, and in doing so, they'd helped countless others rewrite theirs. The wilderness that had once isolated them had become the foundation of their strength. The silence that had imprisoned Elias had taught him to hear what others missed. The exile that had tried to break Clara had forged her into someone unbreakable. And together, they'd proven that the world didn't get to decide who mattered and who didn't. That outcasts could become exactly what their communities needed most. Not comfortable silence, but uncomfortable truth. Not easy acceptance, but difficult justice. Not passive survival, but active transformation. They were Clara and Elias Crow, a physician and an attorney, a wife and husband, partners in every sense that mattered. And they had changed everything.